Good morning, friends. We have today a very interesting talk, which will be different from the usual talk, because this is kind of nearly worldwide type of thing. But maybe I am picking this up to the student, to the person. But we have Sue, who is with us today and is going to be talking on mothering at the sea.
Thank you, Ray. I will share my screen now. Gosh, just need to move that. How do I move that away? Okay, so hopefully you can all see a globe there with the red line around it. Is that right? Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, right then. Okay, good. Stage one done. Right then, I'm going to talk about parenting at sea. And just a sort of bit of background really. In 2008, we lived in Hereford, just outside Hereford, and we sold our house, our car, the contents of our house, and moved into rented accommodation with a few items, and started to look for a boat, which we hoped to find in 2009 with a view to going away sailing. And we sort of flippantly said, oh, we're going to go and sail around the world, but we never really actually sort of thought that that might happen. That was just a throwaway comment, really. We were going to live on a boat. It had been sort of about 10 years in the making, really. 10 years prior to that, my husband, Chris, worked in the oil industry, actually, in North Africa at the time. And he met a very interesting Frenchman who lived on a boat, who bought it as a house, basically, because he didn't have a home at that time, and then learnt to sail it and kept popping up each time Chris saw him. He was in a different part of the world, and Chris thought that was an amazing thing to do. So he persuaded me to do a learn to sail holiday in Greece, in the Ionian, and which we loved. And I imagined that was what the sea was like. Of course, it's actually like a mill pond compared to the ocean, but I didn't realise that at the time. And we did a few RYA courses up to day skipper level. I should say that neither of us had ever sailed a keel boat before we started doing any of this. Chris was a dinghy sailor in his youth, and I used to windsurf. But we sort of learnt the basics, and then we found the perfect boat in 2009. And Chris had done years and years of research into which would be the best boat in terms of solidity, basically the most important thing, keeping us safe. Here she is, basically. So this is Yindee Plus. The plus basically refers to the fact that the previous owner had, or the first owner, I should say, we were the third owners. The first owner had a previous boat called Yindee. The Yindee basically is a sort of Thai word meaning welcome or happy to see you, we believe. Which we thought was nice, and it's thought to be very bad luck to change the name of a boat. So Yindee Plus because the first owner had a Yindee before, so Yindee Plus was Yindee, Yindee 2 effectively. So she is a cutter rig sloop, which means that she's got one mast and two foresails, four sails at the front of the boat. You can see those. 43 foot long. Boats are always you always get the measurement in feet. That's 14.4 meters for anyone who's interested in the metric. 3 cabins, a galley, a kitchen, in other words, a saloon, and 2 heads or toilets. She was built in the UK in the early 1990s, and she's a Seastream 43, and there weren't that many boats made in that make. Basically, the manufacturer kept going broke because they were so over-engineered that they could never really make that much money. But that's good for long-distance sailing. So she's anchored in the Tuamotus in the South Pacific, part of French Polynesia in that picture. I do apologise for sort of graininess of the photos by transferring them several times into this presentation. They're not as crisp and clear as they could be, so sorry for that. So this is the crew, the Bright family. So you can see me, my husband, and our twin boys, Wilf on the left, the dark hair, and Sid on the right with the blonde hair. This is taken in a marina in Turkey where we overwintered, as you do in the Mediterranean, with a crowd of other yachties, basically, in 2010 to 11. So basically, mainly talking about the children and parenting while we were away. So the boys basically were 6 when we left, just 6 when we first left. And actually, although we did a lot of planning about this, there was a little bit of luck involved in that, and that they were at that age when we left. That's the perfect age to take kids sailing. They're sensible at that age. They can follow instructions. So if you ask them to stay put or to sit tight and hold on, or give a hand with some basic thing, they can do that. But they also, kids at that age, just love spending time with their parents. They're perfectly happy to spend years just with the family. They enjoy seeing other children, but they don't absolutely need it. So perfect age to take them. And the other thing is that when you're traveling on a boat or in some other form like a camper van or a canal boat, or you're basically taking your home with you. So although everything else is changing around the children as we travelled, the home stays constant, and all the familiar toys and familiar foods and things like that, that stays constant, and that's really good for kids. We took as many of their toys and games with us as possible, and you'll see some of them in the photos coming up. Obviously, small was best, so and you'll see what's the most popular toy soon. So this is a photo that was probably one of the first couple of days that we were away. They looked really frightened, actually, when I looked at that. I thought it was quite funny. You can basically start to see some of the safety features on the boat. So the boys have both got life jackets on. We all had, top of the range life jackets with tethers. So the yellow bit that's going from the life jacket, you can see that on Sid's better, is attached to a strong point on deck. And the rule was that if we were underway and they were on deck, then they had to have the life jackets on and be attached. Obviously, there were rules for adults as well. Adults had to wear life jackets an hour before sunset and be clipped on as well when on deck, and all night and in any sort of stormy weather. And as they got older, we got more relaxed with those rules, but that was absolutely a critical rule in the early days. And the other safety feature you can see there is the nets. So on the guard wires around the boat, a lot of kid boats, as we used to call them, have these sort of nets around the side decks, because young children could easily sort of slip between those guard wires. Yeah, there we go, smiles now. So you can see in this picture that Wilf's got his life jacket on because he's on deck and he's tethered on. Sid is in the companionway, which is the way down to the down below deck. So he doesn't have to have his life jacket on. And actually, after a while, they use that quite a lot. So basically, you'd see one of them sitting in the top of the companionway because they knew they didn't have to have the life jacket on. So this is a bit of learning on deck, sort of some very basic stuff because we were underway at the time. So the beginning of September 2009, we started boat school. Initially, we decided to stick to term times and school hours, and we took with us teacher lesson plans, basically books based on the UK national curriculum for English, maths and science. For the first month or so, we stuck religiously to the lessons. Involved quite a lot of planning time for us and marking time. But at that age, at 6, it's actually quite easy, really. It's not difficult to teach your own kids at that age. But we realised fairly quickly that the teaching content for primary school kids at age 6 could be really easily condensed into about 2 or 3 hours. And actually, that was quite good quality teaching. So, of course, a lot of the school day is about break times and lunch times and play times and, sort of getting kids from one area to another. So we didn't need to do that, obviously. We pretty quickly ditched the English curriculum, but mainly because it wasn't at all relevant to what we were doing and where we were, and it was tedious. We stuck to the maths though. The maths is really good, the national curriculum for maths, and it was really well taught in terms of the lesson plans. And actually we kept that going all the way through up until age 12. But for English, we decided that writing letters, diary entries, poems, writing about things that we saw basically was good, and plenty good enough, you know, writing in different formats. Also did a lot of practical school. So there's a picture of Sid sat on deck when we were at anchor on top of an upturned dinghy, using a phone that he and Wilf were talking through, just made from bits and bobs that were around. We found that quite a lot of things could be taught on a boat in an interesting way, although we did find that later chemistry experiments were very difficult, partly because obtaining the chemicals was very, very difficult in countries that were quite suspect of importing unusual things. And also you need a flat surface for a lot of experiments. And when we spent the vast amount of our time at anchor without a flat surface on the boat, a completely flat one. We didn't feel the need to teach geography or history because we were surrounded by it, basically. We spent the first year in the Mediterranean, so we visited anything that was interesting nearby. In Greece, that was a lot of ancient ruins, Venetian castles. We went to basically we travelled all around Greece, so we saw all the sort of famous ruins, learnt about ancient Greek myths. Very, very interesting. And they just wrote about that, and their geography and idea of where things were in the world was basically just developing as we travelled. This is Wilf with his nose in a book. Basically, Wilf would probably never have been a reader if we hadn't gone on our trip. He was always a very active kid, and I think he probably just would have played football and rugby and done a lot of sport if he'd stayed in the UK. But he actually became a reader because Sid was, and I was, and it was an easy thing to do on deck. So it's a nice picture to see. So boys on their bikes. Basically, we actually took 4 bikes with us. We had a lot of storage space in our cockpit lockers. So the 2 adult bikes were sort of broken down into bits so that they could be stored easily. But the boys' bikes were just in the cockpit lockers. They did rust over the period of 2 or 3 years, and ended up being donated actually when we were in America to a charity that renovated them and gave them to people who couldn't afford bikes. But that's them in biking along a quay in Turkey, looking happy. It meant that they had some freedom to explore when we were sort of fixed in one place. And in the Mediterranean, what you tend to do is, because the summer months are for sailing and the winter months, the weather can be very unpredictable, and you can get some terrible storms in the Med. So people tend to book into a marina over winter for about 5 or 6 months. If you manage to find a place where there's a good social community, a lot of like-minded yachties, you can have a really great time, which we managed. The first winter we stayed in Kalamata in southern Greece in the Peloponnese, and there were only 3 other sort of yachty crews there, although we made friends with them and we had a nice winter. The second winter, when we were in Turkey, in Finike, there were loads of different boats there, all different nationalities, and the boys were in heaven, basically. There weren't any other kids, but there were loads and loads of surrogate grandparents who loved spoiling them. So that's the result of a day of cycling. Boys asleep, so it gives you a good idea of what their cabin was like. So it's quite a small space compared to what people think how much space people think kids need in a bedroom these days. You can just about see on Sid's bunk at the bottom the lee cloth sort of hanging down. So they both of those under their mattresses, they were tucked in while we didn't need them, and they could put the lee cloths up, stop them rolling out of bed when we were at sea. Actually, their bedroom, this is the midships cabin. You can't see in this picture, but if you could stand back a bit, you'd be able to see there was cupboard space and bookshelves, so there was a bit more space, and a cupboard at the bottom of the bunk as well. So that's the best part of the boat to sleep in, basically, for the most stable motion when the boat's at sea. Right, a picture of some adults now. So basically at the beginning of the trip, we were learning how to handle the boat, how to teach school. But we never actually gave any thought to the fact that there might be others doing similar thing. That sounds an odd thing, but we were so focused on buying the boats, training to learn how to use it, and then getting out there, selling the house, getting the kids out of school, all those sorts of things. And then one day when we were in an anchorage in Greece, someone rowed over in a dinghy and said, "Oh, do you want to come and have a cup of tea on deck?" And that was sort of the beginning of us making friends with anybody else that was in an anchorage with us, basically. So often somebody would come up on the radio and say, "Oh, come around to our boat for sundowners at 5 o'clock." And this is an example of that, basically. So this picture is actually taken in America, in the Intracoastal Waterway, when we got there in 2012. But you can see the boys in the cockpit with all the adults. Sometimes there were kids, mostly it was just adults, but the boys just loved the company and sort of joined in with the chat and everything. It was a brilliant way of sharing experiences and getting advice, getting help. I mean, there's always people who are way more experienced than you, and people would sort of offer parts that if we needed a part to replace a broken bit of equipment, somebody would have something that you needed if we didn't already have it. Getting some tips about what the best way to do things, or the best anchorages, or the best supermarket, or any of those things. And then later on, as we became more experienced, obviously we were able to be the ones doing the experience, giving the advice, which was good way to pay back. The boys had an absolutely wonderful time meeting other adults. They did all sorts of things, like from riding in super fast dinghies with people who'd sort of come over and say, "I'm going to test out my dinghy motor," with the boys, like a ride around the anchorage, which was wonderful. They went octopus fishing with another couple. They did sleepovers on other boats. They went on dog walks. Basically had a really lovely time. The rules with sundowners was always you take your own drinks and nibbles if you like. Nibbles may be provided, but everybody always turned up with their own drinks, because everyone's traveling on a budget, and you can't really invite people around for drinks and then give them whatever they want, whatever your supplies, which always need to last. Okay, Lego was the main thing basically on the boat. We had a box of Lego. We didn't realize this before we left, but Lego was absolutely the best thing to take away with us. Everything we did, or everything we saw, was recreated in Lego. So this picture here is of a Lego boatyard. So on the left of the picture, you can see a travel hoist, which is a large hoist that with big wheels goes either side of the boat in the water, lifts it using straps under the boat, and then brings it out onto the quay. So there's bits of string on there to lift the boat up, and it was all working basically. And then they've got a ramp there, and they've got chocks to chock up boats in the boatyard. Hours and hours of entertainment. There's another Lego model. This is a Lego cable car. So we went, this was after we'd been to Athens, I think. We went in a cable car, and they managed to get it all working. So the cables, you can see Sid's really excited about that. I think the most elaborate model we made, and I couldn't find a photo of it, was a Lego Concorde. After we crossed the Atlantic for the first time, we went to the Concorde Museum in Barbados. Concorde used to fly there. And they were inspired by that. Later on, I feel quite sad about it in a way, in that when we got to Panama, they met a couple of American boys who introduced them to Minecraft, which some of you may know is sort of a virtual Lego game. And that was the end of the Lego, really. So, which is I feel quite sad about, because they spent so many years playing with the Lego. But in fact, Sid still does the Minecraft now, and he's actually building he's helping people build a virtual world. He's doing all the railways. So Mary will smile at that, because my son is mad about railways. So as the boys got a little bit older, they started helping us with our boat chores. So this is a picture of them. This is us hauled out in a boatyard in Kalamata, basically putting some more, they weren't doing the anti-fouling, but we put scrub the bottom of the boat, put anti-foul on the bottom of the boat to stop barnacles attaching to it, which enables the boat to move more smoothly through the water. But they were helping us with polishing the top sides, the white part of the boat. They got bored with it pretty quickly, but they liked helping out with chores in the Med. But everything, when you live on a boat, everything's time consuming, basically. Provisioning, getting food, and bringing it back to the boat. We really rarely hired taxis to do that. Mostly we would have a sack trolley and rucksacks, and we'd go to the local market. We'd all have a bag. We'd all carry certain things back to the boat. If you're doing laundry, you don't have a car or washing machine on the boat. Well, most boats don't. I think more and more do these days. So basically, the sack trolley and the rucksacks came out again and off to the laundrette. I'll show you the next photo. It's got them helping us with the provisioning. Here we go. So this is basically while we're on the hard, which is what it's called when your boat is sort of on the dock. We basically took advantage of the fact there was a nearby Lidl. This was in Greece, and you can see that box there has got UHT milk in it. Basically, we could provision for 3 months. We could easily get 3 months supply of food on board. And actually, when we crossed the Pacific, we managed to store more than that, because you basically planned, obviously want to have enough food for the passages you're making, but also the places that you're going to may be a lot more expensive than the places you're coming from. So Panama, when we were in the Pacific, Panama was much cheaper to provision than the French Polynesia or Tonga or Fiji. So we would basically stow as much as we could on board before we left. Although it makes the boat heavier, it's cheaper in the long run. And we got very creative actually with storage. I'd sort of wake in the middle of the night and think, I've just realised I can put another 10 cans of whatever in this particular space above this area. So this is the boys sort of getting a little bit of independence, and we decided Wilf was really, this looks about age 7. So we decided that Wilf was very keen to use the outboard motor on the dinghy, but we said that until you could row a boat competently and sail a dinghy competently, you weren't allowed to do the outboard motor. And we realised that would make him older when he had a go at the outboard. But also, if your outboard fails, you do need to be able to use the rowing oars. So this is Wilf rowing, and as you can see, which is the dominant of the twins, because he's basically doing all the physical work and Sid's sitting there as a passenger. Interestingly enough, there's no minimum age in most countries and no license required to actually use an outboard motor in a dinghy, which is can be slightly alarming. But in fact, by the time Wilf managed to do it, he was much more competent than a lot of the adults that we saw riding around the marinas and anchorages. So this is step 2. This very scruffy Tinker sailing dinghy we were given by some folks who were trying to offload it, and we kept it on board for quite a while, but we had to get rid of that before we crossed the Atlantic. We just needed the storage space. But this is Wilf in the Canary Islands, basically, sailing the Tinker dinghy. And there we are, gaining his independence. So he was 9 by the time he graduated to using the outboard motor. He obviously did it under supervision to start with, but he was completely competent, very safety minded, and became our regular driver. Basically, we'd all jump in and he'd basically drive the dinghy. And if I go ashore for something and the boat was at anchor, then we'd always take a VHF portable radio with us to shore, and I'd radio him up and he'd come over and pick me up and bring me back to the boat. You can see how much he loves it. So this is our this was our dinghy that we had for most of our world trip. You can see that it's got a grey cover on it. That was handmade by me when we were in the Caribbean, because basically unless you spend a huge amount of money and get a dinghy which has a particular surface on it, the surface is it degrades very quickly in UV light, and obviously most of the trip is in the tropics. So the cover Sunbrella fabric, which is absolutely brilliant, UV resistant, that's to protect it. And likewise, the outboard motor's got a cover on it as well, also made of Sunbrella, which I made myself. So that cover, that grey cover, was absolutely shredded and in pieces by the time the trip ended, but it did its job. So, oh, that's interesting. I think I might have a slide missing there. Yeah, okay. I wasn't expecting that one, but anyway, this is an example of a volcano study that we did when we were in Lanzarote. Basically, our schoolwork over the couple of years, the year in the Mediterranean and then on into the Atlantic, became much more project focused. So as particular areas of the world lend themselves to learning about certain things, and the Canary Islands obviously are fantastic for volcano work. So while we were there, we were able to visit lava fields, see active steam vents, lava tubes. And one of the most amazing things we witnessed there was actually on a relatively recent lava field, I think 300 years old, we actually witnessed the beginnings of new life. So tiny little plants growing on basically the soil that had been created from bird droppings and dust, which was incredible. And we actually saw that again on coral atolls, on the bit of the atoll where the broken coral is, and then get the same sort of beginnings of new life. We also started to meet other kids. Once we got out of the Mediterranean, where we only met 2 boat families, we started to meet other boat kids, basically, and lots of other nationalities as well, doing different versions of boat school. And interesting enough, there are very specific sort of characteristics, I suppose, for the different nationalities. For example, Dutch kids are absolutely not allowed out of school. It's against the law to take your children out of school in the Netherlands. So any Dutch children we met were under school age. So they were always young, sort of 2, 3, 4. And they had to get back to the Netherlands before the age of 5, when the kids were starting school. French kids could go anywhere they liked in the world, but they absolutely must follow the French curriculum. Australian kids could go anywhere in the world and actually got free resources and study support from Australia, because obviously a lot of kids in remote areas of the outback have to have access to schooling that may not be available where they're living. So, and that schooling is available to all Australian kids in the world. Americans can do what they like, basically. So they've got free control over the curriculum and how they teach their kids. But there are private schools that exist that a lot of families signed up to, which specifically supported children that were travelling. And interestingly enough, in the UK, you can take your kids out of school and you can teach them whatever. Well, this is when we left. That may have changed recently, but you're not given any help unless you sign up to a private system, and you can basically do what you like. So this is a picture of a very poor picture of Chris. He's not very flattering one, of Chris on the HF radio. So as we left the Mediterranean, we started joining radio nets. Basically, there are particular good times of year to cross each of the oceans. And so you automatically get a gathering of boats that are all traveling the same way at a similar time. They're not necessarily traveling exactly on the same time, but within about 2 or 3 months, a huge number of boats will be crossing an ocean at the same time. So some of you may have heard of the ARC, the Atlantic Rally for Cruisers. That's a sort of an organised rally, a group of boats that leave the Canary Islands at the end of October, heading to St. Lucia in the Caribbean. That travels each year. But that's something that most people know about, a lot of people know about, but what most people don't know is that there's the number of informal rallies, if you like, traveling at the same time is huge and outweighs the number of people on the ARC. So those groups of people sort of informally form radio nets. So you decide on a radio frequency, on HF radio, which most people still have in their boats, because it's by far a safer system than just having a satellite phone these days, because you can speak to lots of people at the same time. So when we left when we were leaving the Med and going into the Atlantic, we joined a radio net, and basically you'd meet on the radio at a certain time each day. And it would be a UTC time, so it'd be, basically you'd reset your own time to that. there'd be a sort of a similar format each day. So basically there'd be a net controller for each day. And actually the net that we were in when we crossed the Atlantic, there was a different net controller for each day of the week. But that net controller would come up on the radio at the appointed time, they make a call for emergency traffic. So they'd say, is there any emergency traffic? And if please speak now. And if anybody was having an emergency on their boat, that would be the time when they would call up, ask for help. And then one of the other experienced people would then go to a different frequency and talk to them about it, and then they can report back later. It's incredibly helpful to have that. When we were one of our Atlantic passages, one of the boats lost its rudder, had a collision with what they thought was probably a whale, and which ripped off their entire rudder. And by the expertise of people on the radio net, and by the radio talks each day, they were able to jerry-rig a system whereby they were able to continue with their voyage across the Atlantic. It took them an extra 3 weeks, I think, to cross, so a 5-week passage in total. But they kept in contact with people. People dropped them off, were able to, I think somebody even managed to drop them a Christmas cake because they weren't going to get there by Christmas. But an incredible support network. And they afterwards said that they don't think they would have managed to do it without that. Likewise, in the Pacific, the Pacific is an awful ocean for rigging failures, basically, because it's much lighter winds and your boat tends to rock and shake, and there's a lot more vibration. So unless you're rigging, your mast and your wires that hold down the rigging are secure, then you can get rigging failures. And we had one boat that basically the mast didn't come down, though that does happen, but he wasn't able to use the mast because of rigging failure. And we arranged to basically change our course so that we could line up with him and come into contact, so that he was motoring with an American boat. They had a lot of fuel on board already, but we basically rendezvoused with them and kept close to them just in case they ran out of fuel, so that we could give them ours. So those absolutely invaluable support and help on the radio net. But the other things that we talk about on the net were basically every boat that was listening would radio up, say what their position was and what the weather conditions and ocean conditions were for each boat. It was a really good way of we write all this information down, and you could sort of map where people were. And then if you didn't hear from them on the radio, you would actually have a record of what position they were in the last time you heard from them. When we crossed the Atlantic, the kids had a kids net afterwards. So all the other kid boats that were traveling, I think there were about 4 of them. There was an Argentinian boat, an American boat, a Swiss-German boat, and us. And so the kids would be able to talk at the end of the radio net. This is a picture of, a more flattering picture, I should say, of me catching our dinner. So we trolled a line behind the boat, basically every ocean passage that we did. We caught, I think we caught about 3 of these mahi-mahis, really big fish, as you can see. This one of the sad things, they're absolutely beautiful, sort of jade-coloured, glistening, beautiful fish in the water. And then you pull them out of the water and they sort of go this grey and yellow colour afterwards. We fished for the first couple of oceans, and by the end of that, we just couldn't bear to sort of pull them out of the water anymore. So we actually stopped after that. But we did eat every single bit of it. It would give us 5 meals and a soup de poisson, which is one of Chris's speciality, as the last meal using the bones. So yeah, most boats do troll a line when they're crossing oceans. So this is us in the Caribbean now. So I thought Sid ought to get a photo in, basically. So this is him just drinking some coconut water on the beach. And coconut water was, although it's imported, and I shouldn't really do that from overseas these days with climate change, I still love coconut water, and it's so hydrating. You can drink, if you drink a litre of coconut water, anecdotally, it feels like you've had about 3 litres of water. So drank a lot of that. So boat kids, basically. So once we got across the Atlantic, all the boat kids that we travelled with went their separate ways. But as we travelled up the Caribbean chain, the British Virgin Islands, the Bahamas, we met other friends that we'd met before, but we didn't actually meet many other kids. But when we arrived in the USA, where we decided to spend hurricane season, and when you cross the Atlantic, there are sort of 2 or 3 options basically for what to do about hurricanes. You can go up the east coast of the States as far as Maine, which is what we decided to do. You could go south to Trinidad or Grenada as well, although Grenada has been hit by hurricanes in the last 10 years. Or you can carry on to go to the ABC Islands, which are north of Venezuela, although not so safe these days, or go to Panama and on through to the Pacific, or spend the hurricane season in Central America. But anyway, we went up the Caribbean chain, Bahamas, and then crossed the Gulf Stream, arrived in Charleston, South Carolina, and met this family, American family, who basically were living on their boat, but they were basically traveling to the Caribbean and then back to the States. And they'd done that sort of 2 or 3 years in a row. But they had 3 girls, and I think that's just Sid in that picture, and their 3 girls. And the kids absolutely got on brilliantly, and we're still in contact with them today. So it didn't, with boat kids, one thing that doesn't matter is to have a boat kid friend the same age as you or the same sex as you. When you get a group of boat kids together, they're just happy to have other kids in company. So they'll basically play really happily in a large group, you know, with the oldest being a teenager right down to sort of a toddler. Then here's another picture of the same group. This is in Maine. So we actually travel. We didn't travel with them, but we met them a couple of times on the way up, and we did meet them in Maine. So this was anchored in an absolutely wonderful anchorage in Vinyl Haven, one of the islands off the coast of Maine. And the kids basically had an amazing sort of famous 5 type 2 or 3 weeks together, sort of just rowing around and exploring and making dens on islands and things. Lovely memories. This is sort of earlier on in that American sort of trip. So this is there's another girl in there who was on a UK boat, and they did a bit of schooling together. So this was making ovens out of silver foil and things, and cooking. I can't remember what they cooked on it, but they did cook something successfully on it. So an example of boat kids doing school together. So this one this is when we left the USA, that when we left the north of the USA, we decided that it would be really interesting. And we'd heard from other cruisers that we'd met about the Intracoastal Waterway, the ICW in the USA. And for anyone who doesn't know about it, it's the most amazing network. I think it's about 2,000 miles or 3,000 if you go right round to the Bay of Mexico. Basically goes all the way from Virginia all the way down to Miami, and basically you have a series of canals, sounds, rivers, and they're all interconnected. You can see in this picture, there's a boat ahead of us. That's some friends of ours on a British boat called Matador, going through a swing bridge. So the bridge is swung to let them through. Hundreds of swing bridges on this route. So you radio up using VHF radio up the bridge controller, asking very politely using sir or madam in the USA if they would kindly open the bridge for you, and they do, and then you proceed on to the next one. So this says watching out for stumps, because there are sort of the stumps of trees that have died in the waterways and that can basically take your rudder off or your propeller off. So we're watching, the boys are ahead, sort of watching out for those on our route, but also enjoying being on deck. You can see in this picture, they've just got buoyancy aids on in this one. We're not at sea, the boat's quite level and flat, the water's still, so the rules have been relaxed. And we did the whole of the Intracoastal Waterway as far as we could, as far as Miami, because there's a bridge that's slightly too low to get under at that point. Basically, I absolutely loved the planning of it. Every evening it would take me 1 or 2 hours to work out our route for the next day. A lot of it is tidal, so we'd have to work out the tidal ranges, whether the keel of our boat would fit in the depths of water. And there were some particular parts where you'd only be able to get through at high water and have an inch under the keel. So it was quite sort of nerve-wracking at times. But we used there was a virtual. We had sort of permanent internet when we were in the States. They were sort of quite advanced with that at that time from the boat. So we were able to use a virtual planner for the route. And we could actually take advice from boats that were ahead of us, telling us which was the best route through certain places, and where we could expect the shallowest water. So that was really useful. That boat ahead of us, our friends who we travelled with from Turkey, sort of seen them on and off, they actually got engine trouble just soon after this picture and had to stop to fix it. And funnily enough, we never sailed with them again, even though they were planning to continue on the same route as us. Well, they're still friends of ours and we see them, but we've never sailed with them again. And you basically never know what's ahead for you on a boat. You can't, they always say that your plans are written in the sand, and it's very true. You just, you can't truly plan to be somewhere at any time. That's a little bit further down in the Intracoastal Waterway, the Dismal Swamp. Brilliant name. We couldn't resist going there with the name like that. And it's as narrow as you can see, basically, all the way. And it was autumn, beautiful autumn colours, lots of national parks along the way that we could stop at and go and see the wildlife. It was a really fabulous trip. Okay, so this is after we left the USA, we headed down to Cuba, the Grand Cayman Islands, and then down to Panama, where we went through the Panama Canal, which I can highly recommend if anyone's interested in doing that. You can actually do a small cruise through the Panama Canal. It's absolutely fascinating, learning all about the construction of the canal and actually going through it on a boat. It's an amazing experience. But this is the Pacific crossing. So Pacific, basically, when we crossed the Atlantic the first time from the Med, we actually took an American girl as crew with us because we weren't really sure whether, having never crossed an ocean, we weren't really sure whether we could actually do it, just the two of us. And she was really helpful. But when we came to crossing the Pacific, we weren't really keen on taking somebody for the whole time. It was going to be about 6 months getting from one side to the other. And the boys were older. So this is Wilf, age 9, who's firmly becoming a competent crew. So this is a picture of him helping Chris pole out one of our foresails. So basically it's all downwind sailing. So you actually have to tie out the sails to the front of the boat to stop them sort of banging from side to side, and to give you what's called a good downwind rig to keep moving along nicely. You can see on this picture, the bars behind where Wilf stood. Our fenders are tied on deck, but they're covered with covers again to protect them from UV light. And you can also see in that picture a very large hatch on top of the coach roof, which we could open. It opened forward, so when we were at anchor, you could get an absolutely fantastic draft coming through there to cool the boat down. Not many boats had that. That was a really useful feature on our boat. So we needed a little bit of entertainment while we were at sea. So this is Sid basically dressing up halfway across the Pacific, dressing up as Neptune. We needed some treats. So from Panama, we didn't stop at the Galapagos, which a lot of boats did, but we literally couldn't afford it. They charge enormous anchoring fees to land there. So we kept going at 5 weeks from Panama to French Polynesia to the first stop there, and we had halfway parties, had special treats. We kept ourselves amused. It was really only the last couple of days that we, this is a picture of us sewing at sea, trying to avoid boredom. So the screens on the side of the boat you can see there, made out of a material called Pfeiffertex, which is absolutely brilliant invention. So you can see through them. You can't see through them that clearly in this picture, but you can see through them, so you can keep a watch. But they cut out, I think it's 80% of UV light, but they let a draft through, so there's a very fine net. And they're UV resistant. So those are screens that I made at some point. And we used to have them down at sea in very sort of calm conditions where we were not expecting to see many ships. We could go for days without seeing any ships or other vessels in the Pacific, but we would basically set a timer on an iPod or something to stand up and have a look around about every 15 minutes. So here's Chris having a look, got the binoculars out. You can actually see some land in the distance there. So we were passing, that was probably the outer islands of French Polynesia when we were getting close to where we were going. Sid's reading a book again. So is Wilf, actually behind the steering wheel. You can see the red sail-like item at the back of the boat there, the stern, is our wind steering. That's a hydrovane. So basically you can set that up and it steers the boat according to the wind direction, which is totally doesn't take any power at all. It's just wind driven. It's absolutely brilliant device, steered us across all our oceans. We're nearly getting to the end of our slide. So we've got, this one is a picture of us crossing the equator. I think we crossed the equator 5 times in all. But each time we crossed the equator, we made offerings to Neptune. So this is sort of special things like Coke. We poured like 10 mils of Coke, very precious. We couldn't spare more than that. Or crisps. We would each write a poem and read it out. And this picture shows Wilf with glasses, which means it tells me probably this was crossing the equator just south of Singapore after we'd left New Zealand and Australia. We spent 7 months in New Zealand after crossing the Pacific, sort of overwintering again. Actually, it's not overwintering in South Pacific, it's over summering, if you like, it's their hurricane season. But on the approach to New Zealand, 3 of us could see the long white cloud, which is famous to sailors for sort of seeing New Zealand in the distance. Wilf couldn't see it at all. So we realised that actually there might be something wrong with his eyes. So when we got to New Zealand, we went to Specsavers as one of our first trip. And the result was glasses basically for Wilf. So that's the difference in that picture. So formal schooling. So when we left New Zealand, the boys were 11. And we knew that they'd return to when we returned to the UK, they'd go back into the school system. So we actually signed up for a secondary level tuition course and had work set by tutors for English, maths and science, just to make sure that they were on schedule. We learnt from other parents that it's very difficult to teach your own children once they get to the age of 11 or 12. And it's absolutely true. Once they get to that age, they just don't want us to teach them, and didn't want us to teach them anymore. The last year, 12 to 13 was a struggle. I spent a lot of time worrying that they'd be behind their peers when we got back to the UK, because we could, with all the travelling that we were doing at the time, and we needed to get back in 1 year from Southeast Asia. We only managed to teach them 1 term of the whole year for English, maths and science. We did teach it in depth, but it was a huge worry to me that they would be so far behind when we got back. In fact, once we got back to the UK, the school, Gordano School, put them in sort of the lowest sets, sort of set 4 for everything when they first started. But probably within the first 8 months, they'd already gone up to the top sets, or sets 1 and 2 for all subjects. So that was a relief to us. Next, just a picture of, this is a picture of, oh, sorry, gone on 2 there. Studying in Bali, so it's basically taking advantage of table and chairs. We were sort of stuck in Bali, which sounds a bit a strange thing to say, but we had a propeller problem, so we were in Bali for a month trying to get that fixed, which is not an easy thing to do, importing things into Indonesia. The bureaucracy and red tape is quite extensive. You might be able to see how red Sid's face is, and he's so hot there studying, but they were diligent with their studies. But one thing we did do in Bali was we actually paid for them to have a surfing course. So they learned to sail, which was a brilliant experience. And a lot of cruising families who go around the world managed to had bigger budgets than us. So the kids did dive courses and were qualified dive instructors and things by the time they finished their trip, or all sorts of other things like that. But we didn't have the funds to do that. But this one occasion, we decided to do it, and they really enjoyed doing that. Visiting, so this is just to show that we can continue to visit anything that was near us. So as we went through the Komodo National Park, we went and saw these Komodo dragons, had a guided tour. That was incredibly interesting. Indonesia was the most amazing country for variety and interest. Not an easy country to visit in its remoter areas because of difficult communications and healthcare, etc. But hugely rewarding in terms of the interest there. This was in Rodrigue, which is one of the sister islands to Mauritius, where giant tortoises used to live and thrive until they were exterminated basically by travelling sailors who would basically put them on board as a ready meal. These ones are actually imported back into Rodrigue from a different area, but amazing, these giant tortoises. We took our tents with us. So this is when we were in South Africa. This is going on a camping trip in the Cederberg. We used our tents probably 2 or 3 times when we were away, just to do short trips on a budget. This is now crossing the southern Indian Ocean. This is in Cocos Keeling. I don't know whether anyone's heard of that. That's one of the small atolls. It's Australian owned, north of Australia, fairly close to Christmas Island, which is a place that a lot of people have heard of. Absolute paradise there. It's a brilliant anchorage for visiting boats. You get the benefit of the sort of smooth clearance procedures associated with Australia, although they're quite rigorous. You have, as long as you follow the procedure, it's all smooth and easy. Easy provisioning there, but absolutely paradise for the kids. They made this rather rubbish raft, which sank quite quickly, but had a lot of fun meeting other boat kids there and playing on the beach. And this was age sort of 11, basically, so able to do more. And this was us anchored there in Cocos Keeling. You notice there's a black ball hanging between the 2 foresails. That's an anchor ball, which the rules basically say you must hang a circular ball or object in the foremost part of the boat when you're at anchor. So that's us obeying the rules, which we did all the time. A lot of boats don't do that, but that's our anchor ball. More boat kids, so we continue to meet boat kids. This is us in a marina in Cape Town, sort of in the shadow of Table Mountain. Amazing location at the Royal Cape Yacht Club. This was a British family we met. The kids had a great time together. We spent about a month there with them. And this is sort of progression, basically. So Wilf, this is crossing the southern Indian Ocean. Wilf hand steering the boat. We had an equipment failure. You can't see the red sail at the back behind him because the stem of that actually snapped mid-ocean after 20 years of hard use. And we had to hand steer the boat, basically. Nobody hand steers a boat across an ocean. It's just too exhausting. So you either use an auto helm, which is an electronic device, or a wind controlled steering, which is what we had and what most boats have to use less power. So the last 3 days, I think it was, we had to hand steer. So this is Wilf hand steering for his 2-hour watch, crossing the southern Indian Ocean, huge swells, very difficult job, but he was so competent at it. Obviously, we were supervising him. We didn't allow him to be completely on his own there. But yeah, he's an amazing job for a 12-year-old. When I think about it now, I almost think, well, is that, could that be defined as child abuse? I hope not, but he was competent. Sid Reading. Sid was always a passenger on our trip. He's not practical, but he observed everything and gave us, basically could always tell us what a make of boat was, or what was going on around him. This is Wilf again, anchoring the boat, so standing in the foredeck, laying the chain, again, extremely competent. This is taken, this is in the Caribbean near the very end of our trip, so Wilf's quite big there, nearly 13, anchoring in Antigua, just soon before we set off north to head for the Azores on our way home. This is before that, so this is arriving in Grenada as circumnavigators. So that's a nice photo. You can see the boys actually look quite chubby. Actually arrived back in the UK quite overweight because they'd spent a year on a boat basically getting back home without very much exercise. So they soon lost that after we got back, but yeah, that's the reason for that. So yeah, that was quite an achievement. There's a bottle of sparkling wine that we bought in South Africa just in case we managed to get to Grenada and do it. And yes, that's the end of our slide. So YindeePlus.net was our website, which we had running while we were on our trip. So if anyone's interested in looking at that, it's a very basic website because I did it and I'm not at all I'm not at all technical, but there's lots of photos. If you look at the news section on that website, basically that's where all the archived blogs are effectively. It should really be called blogs, but we don't have access to it anymore. It's basically a closed website. But yeah, that was our trip. So I think I can stop sharing now. There we are. So I hope that wasn't too overwhelming. It's different. You don't actually get other people's response while you're talking. So hopefully I haven't bored anyone to tears and you're nodding off. Sorry, I can't hear you, Ray.
You can't hear me?
I can hear you now, yeah.
Oh, jolly good. I said, okay, friends, questions and comments to Sue, please.
Oh, it was wonderful. It was just like going on a world tour. I kept thinking, why didn't I do that? Why didn't I do that? Really, thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. It was. I've really enjoyed looking back through the photos, actually. So it's been nice for me as well.
Yeah.
So, how healthy did everybody keep? Were there any particular moments?
But you know that, Mary, that's an interesting question, because you think with the travel and eating all sorts of different food in all sorts of locations, then you might come across being really unhealthy from time to time. But actually, we were incredibly healthy all the time, and we rarely met cruising folk who were unhealthy. I think lots of fresh air. What we had in our water system, we had a very high-tech filter underneath our freshwater tap. When we put water in our water tanks, it would be filtered by this high-tech filter. So when the water came out of the tap, it was pure, totally pure. And then we'd keep jugs of that in the fridge, and that's the only thing we drank. And we'd never had any problems with that. Food, I think on 2 occasions we had tummy upsets. One was a dodgy ice cream in Greece at the beginning of the season, so probably the freezer had been turned off and then they turned it back on again. And the other time was the boys had a drink in Cuba, which had ice in it, which probably really ice wasn't that exactly, but literally a couple of tummy upsets, and that was it. Interestingly, anecdotally, talking to other cruisers, we would find that people were very healthy, but then people could suddenly die of cancer. So it was basically the things that weren't being done were routine health checks. And, you know, if in the UK, if you've got a little niggle, not these days because it's hard to get a GP appointment. Say 5 years ago, you just go to the GP and get something checked out, and people wouldn't do that because they just didn't have access to it. So yeah, so that was that we heard of that 2 or 3 times. You know, so and so had got ill, and then very quickly, within 2 or 3 months, had died of cancer. So, but not very often. But yeah, very healthy on the whole.
I should think your sons have left school by now, haven't they?
They left this summer. Yeah. So one of them has got a job already, didn't want to go to university, just wanted to get a job, a proper job. So he's got a job in a company that makes plasterboard and fireproof board with career progression in it. So he's got a car, he's got a girlfriend, so he's off basically. The other one is going to university next September. So we're doing the rounds of university open days.
David.
Yeah, well, absolutely fantastic, Sue. What a wonderful story. What an adventure. And, you know, talking about parenting at sea, but I think that your children must have had just the most wonderful childhood. You're talking about yachty children. I was a seaside kid, and it was like that. We would just go down to the beach, and if our mother wanted to feed us, she had to come and find us. But what a wonderful adventure for you all. I have got a question, which is you were talking about being on a budget. How do families handle that? Did you have money saved up to take you through the trip? You can't earn money whilst you're on sailing, or what do you do?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. Basically, our plan was to sell our house. My husband was earning quite good money in the oil industry, so our house was paid for. We had lived in a farmhouse in Hereford, so we sold our house and contents. And our plan was to invest the money and then to live off the interest. And my husband's good with financial management. He'd worked out that the money back from it, the interest should be about 25,000 a year. So that was our travelling fund.
Right.
We sold our house in 2008, and the financial crisis hit. So by that point, we'd already committed, and we basically spent our capital. Not all of it. We came back with about 150,000, I think, but we basically spent the capital.
Yeah.
But you know, we don't ever regret doing that. So,
no,
but yeah, interestingly enough, these days we met towards the end of our trip. We met a lot of people who were running their business from their boat. So if you've got something you can do virtually that doesn't require a lot of equipment around you, then it's quite possible to do that. people had various methods actually. Some people had rented their house out, and they were living off the rental income and savings. Yes, lots of different models. Some people, we'd come across people in places of the parts of the world that were very easy to live cheaply. They'd bought a boat there and they were living there, and then they could live off a tiny amount of money. It's really expensive actually doing the sort of traveling that we did, because when you cross an ocean, your boat has to be fully equipped, and you can't get away with, you know, a rigging that's not quite right. You know, everything has to be perfect if you're going to safely cross an ocean. So you have to replace things that are broken, and that's really expensive. And if you're in a part of the world where it's even more expensive, you just have to pay that. So yeah, it's not something, it's something you can do on a bit of a budget. So we were obviously on a budget in the sense that we were cutting down on we didn't do expensive trips, and we didn't buy expensive food, and we didn't eat out. We ate one meal out in each country we visited, but that was it, you know, just to taste try the food. Apart from street food when we got to Southeast Asia, which was wonderful and cheap, and we could do a lot of that. But yeah, when I say living on a budget, obviously you're doing the trip, which is an expensive thing in itself, but we were keeping down the costs that we could keep down.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the downside of people working from their boat, though, is that, you know, one huge part of it for us was actually having a completely different lifestyle. And that living off a budget, doing things in a very basic way, actually takes you sort of really back to nature, for want of a better way of saying it, and makes you reevaluate your whole life and what you need, and it gives you an appreciation of the fact that actually, yeah, interestingly enough, we were talking about this one day with about refugees and immigrants coming over and things, and we were sort of saying that most people in the UK have absolutely no concept of what it is to be unsafe and then finding a place of safety. Whereas if you're on a boat in a storm, crossing an ocean or crossing a piece of water, and then you get to a safe anchorage, you drop your anchor and you're safe, and you've got food and water on the table. It's such an incredible feeling. And not many people experience that these days, whereas people obviously years and years ago used to. So yeah, those sorts of experiences, I think, are things that stay with you and are worth having. And if you work from your boat, then you're sort of continuing the present life on a boat in a different location rather than actually changing everything about your life. So, but obviously, you know, people have different ways of doing things. So, yeah.
Did 43 feet on many occasions feel far too small?
Another good question. Do you know, I don't think it did actually, because the thing with the length of the boat is you've got to maneuver it as well. So these days, when we first started off, 43 foot was average basically for a family sailing around the world, or indeed a couple. When we finished 7 years later, 43 foot was on the smaller end of the scale. You know, people were sailing 50 foot, 65 foot boats with just a couple doing it. But you've got to maintain all of that boat, so that's more anti-fouling, more painting, more varnishing for a bigger space. But you've also got to maneuver it, sometimes in tight marinas. And I used to find that incredibly stressful, moving in a marina, because your boat's designed to go across an ocean. It's not really designed to be moved in a tight space, not a boat that designed like that. So 43 foot was plenty enough for us in terms of maneuvering. But we had such a lot of storage space on board that we managed to fit everything in. So no, I don't think we ever felt that 43 foot was not enough, actually.
Wow.
Very interesting. Yes, I'm quite green with envy. I'm sorry I missed the beginning. My laptop was very slow to log on for some reason. Presumably you had done a lot of sailing beforehand.
No, I said that. That's the bit you missed, actually. No, when my husband was a dinghy sailor in his youth, and I used to windsurf, but neither of us had done any keelboat sailing before we learnt to sail to do this trip.
Right.
So we did, by the time when we actually left, I'd done 500 miles basically, which was nothing because I've done 5,000 miles now. So if you hear of someone who sailed 5,000 miles, then they may have sailed around the world, because that's about how many miles it is, approximately. But no, the two things we did to sort of ameliorate that, we basically we didn't sail from the UK. So basically Chris and some friends who were experienced sailors took the boat, delivered the boat to Greece, which is where I'd learned to sail. And then the boys and I flew to Greece and met them there so that we could basically start off in a familiar environment, learning to handle the boat. Because we hadn't sailed the boat in the UK when we left, so in very gentle conditions. And we built up from there, basically, ended up sailing around Greece and then Turkey and then back across the Med. So did it in sort of incremental stages so that we could keep ourselves as safe as possible.
How did you handle the nail-biting grandparents?
Well, what do you mean by how did we manage to? We basically, while we were in the Med when we first left, we flew back home. I think 3 times from the Med, so we saw grandparents on each of those occasions. My parents came out to visit us in Turkey, stayed in a sort of a nearby hotel and came out on a boat trip with us. But once we got further afield, it became more difficult. The boys and I flew back from the Caribbean to my parents' Ruby wedding anniversary party and stayed then. And then we flew back when we were in New Zealand. So actually funding these trips was relatively expensive. What was the reason we couldn't stop at the Galapagos is because we could either fly back from New Zealand to see the grandparents or we could stop at the Galapagos. And we decided it was more important to see for the children to see their grandparents and me to see my parents. So, but yeah, that's basically something you sacrifice and I'm torn because although we had an amazing time and the children had an incredible childhood, we sacrificed them growing up with their grandparents. Basically, that was the thing that they didn't get, and part of me will always feel sad about that. But you can't do both. Basically, we did as much as we can in terms of getting home to visit, and kept in contact. We kept in contact with FaceTimes and emails and things, but it's not quite the same, is it?
Do you and your husband still sail?
We haven't sailed. Well, when we got back to the UK, we came to Portishead, straight from the Azores, and we came here so that the boys could. Basically, we had to choose somewhere in the UK with a marina within walking distance of a school and within a bus ride of a job, basically. So we knew that I trained to be a nurse in Bristol, so we knew the Bristol area. So friends of ours who'd already circumnavigated were in Portishead Marina, and they said, "Come here, it's perfect." So we did. We applied. We arrived. I'd never been to Portishead before. I came in through the lock gates by boat, and we tied up and got it all sorted. So I forgot what your question was. So, what was your question, Ray?
Do you and your husband still sail?
Still sail. So basically, we did. No, we haven't sailed since. We basically bought the house very sadly, but fortuitously, I should say. My mother-in-law died as we were on our way back. We diverted to Bermuda so that Chris could get back to her funeral. But half the sale of her house enabled us with the remains of our capital to buy a small house in Portishead. So we moved onto land. Then we sailed the boat to Cardiff to put her in a workshop to get her repainted and do some major repairs before we put her on the market. And we sold her a year after that. So we haven't sailed our boat since then, or any others actually. We still have our life jackets just in case, but no, we haven't sailed since. And I don't know whether we will again. Almost, it's a strange thing, isn't it? And we've talked about in the future buying a narrow boat and doing all the waterways of the UK. That might be something we do, but I think we've both had enough of oceans, so I don't think we'll be crossing an ocean again. We did 5 ocean passages. I think that's probably enough. We can tick that one off.
David.
A question I asked another guy who pedaled a boat around the world. Did you have any kind of mystical experiences on your travels, of sort of feeling one with nature or whatever, that kind of thing?
There was one occasion in the South Pacific. I'd been very, very anxious about crossing oceans when we left. And my best friend had sort of said, well, she's a Quaker, incidentally. She said, I'll think of you, and I'll be sending you thoughts. And basically, when we set off across the Pacific, I had a message from her saying, she said, I'm thinking of birds sailing alongside you, flying alongside you, and I'm sending you thoughts and wishes. And I knew she was thinking of us. And each night when we were crossing the Pacific, I was on night watch. These white birds would come and fly next to the sails each night for about 5 or 6 nights in a row. And my husband never saw them. And I don't even know whether they were there or not. It was quite, and I often think about that. It was quite a surreal experience. So yeah, that was the mystical experience of the trip.
Beautiful.
Any further thoughts and comments, friends?
Well, just to say, full of wonder and gratitude that you had such a great and a safe journey with your children, and for sharing your story. It's lovely, wonderful experience.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. That was fascinating for all of us here. I'd like to thank you very much for coming and speaking to us.